Despite efforts to enhance reporting, like the Equator Network, incomplete reporting remains a substantial barrier to the translation of evidence into practice. As a former practitioner, a current researcher, systematic reviewer, and all-time evidence guru, Paul Glasziou is well placed to report the findings of Paper 5, reducing waste from incomplete or unusable reports. Paul.
Thanks very much, Bill. I'm sure you'll be very relieved to hear that there's only one more method of avoidable waste that we're going to talk about before we hand over to the panel after afternoon tea. So this is the fifth stage. Originally, as Ian had mentioned this morning, we had 4 stages of waste, but as Ian again mentioned this morning, the NIHR, Rory Milne and his team, got very enthusiastic about this and ended up adding this middle column that you've heard about. I'm going to talk about this last column, which is the unbiased and unusable reports of research, even when they are published, which we've heard through An-Wen Chan, that's not all that often. I'd just like to thank all my co-authors and mention their sort of backgrounds, which is actually a mixture of medical writers, psychologists, systematic reviewers, clinical epidemiologists, statisticians, and myself. I'm a part-time general practitioner, but also mostly a clinical epidemiologist. So I've been concerned about this, the usability of the research that I try and use in primary care. Ian had pointed out to me that Austin Bradford Hill, in reporting good clinical trials, had written this nice, or someone had written for him this nice piece saying that there are 4 questions that need to be answered in any report. That's why did you start, what did you do, what answer did you get, and what does it mean to anyone anyway? The paper addresses, and you'll see the headings for it, all 4 questions. I'm going to focus on what did you do. In fact, An-Wen has talked quite a bit about our problems in the answers that we get, the biased reporting that he talked about of things being changed for their primary endpoints. So I feel like they've been covered a bit, so I'm going to focus on this one, but you can read about the rest in the other parts of the paper. Before I do that, though, something that people always say to me when we talk about the avoidable waste in research is saying, well, isn't waste in research a necessary thing? And I say, yes, there is a necessary form of waste. That is, a lot of research, we have a hypothesis and it fails, and it can fail repeatedly, and that's fine. That's what research is about. And it reminds me of this wonderful quote from Edison, who said, young man, he was being asked about, he hadn't yet got to a usable light bulb. And he was asked about this, and he said, young man, why would I feel like a failure, and why would I ever give up? I now definitively know over 2,000 ways that an electric light bulb won't work. Success is almost in my grasp. I think it actually took him 6,000 attempts to get there of various things. So he got to the little carbon filament from a thread first of all, and eventually he found a type of bamboo in Kyoto. It was the thread that was actually used for the first several years of their successful electric light bulb, because it lasted long enough to be commercially successful. So a lot of failure there. But he never could have got there if he didn't keep careful records of what had failed. And in a sense, research it's like Edison's laboratory, but running all around the world as a collaborative effort. And if we don't tell each other about our failures as well as our successes, and exactly what we did, then our research is slowed down. So we must report those failures and the details of those failures, otherwise it's an avoidable waste. And he may have taken years longer to get there if he hadn't kept those careful records. So I just wanted to make that distinction. So I'm going to talk about some of the difficulties we have in knowing what people have done in the research they publish, and the difficulty that creates in the replication, as Mike just talked about. And one of my favourite titles of a paper last year was this one by Cart called The Secret Lives of Experiments, where he looked at functional MRI studies in 241 different studies and talked about measured a whole lot of different parameters that are needed to be done in an MRI study, which I don't understand the acronyms of, but he found that the majority of them, for some of these parameters they were commonly reported, but there were things that were very rarely reported. And the majority of these studies, he said, were basically not replicable because the methods weren't sufficiently well described. And I put up here one of the news sort of blogs about it in a thing called Research Digest from the British Psychological Society. And I put this up because I was interested in reading the comments on this paper. And a couple of interesting comments that I think are worth noting, because these are common objections to the problem that research should be reducible. And the first comment was, putting all that detail would make the paper quite inaccessible if every detail were published. The response to that was, well, you can use supplementary information posted online. So make it available. You just don't have to make it that everybody has to read that. The people who want to read it can, but you can still make it available. So it's a non-issue, really. You can make the methods available. The second one was very interesting as well. He said, well, contacting the author directly would provide a lot of the necessary information, wouldn't it? I'll come back to that when we talk about some of our research in trying to get information from authors. But this guy said, I've gotten about a 10% response rate. Sometimes the authors of studies have died or moved out of the field and the information is lost forever. We often imagine that sitting somewhere in that laboratory is all of the details and we just have to go to the notebooks and we can resurrect it. But that's not true. The hard disks die, computers get thrown away, the data disappears forever. And I'll again give you some data on that a little later on. I want to give you an example though from one of my own areas in general practice, which in part was the trigger for me getting interested in this whole area, because I was trying to use research in practice and finding it very frustrating to do so. So I'll just give you one example of this and give you some general examples of it. This is a very important study that was published in the BMJ back in 2007, the TOHP study. It was the first to show that lowering your salt intake could lower clinical outcomes. Lots of studies had shown that if you lower your salt intake, you can lower your blood pressure. But they didn't show that that actually improved cardiovascular outcomes, whereas the TOHP study was the first to do that. Now here is what the study said in this publication in the BMJ. Individual and weekly group counselling sessions were offered initially, with less intensive counselling and support thereafter specific to sodium reduction. So me as a GP, it's Monday morning, a patient comes in, they want to know about salt reduction. What do I tell them they're going to do? Should I just recommend they go to weekly counselling? Or should I say lower your salt? Or what is it I would say to them? That was the entire description in the paper. Okay, so if I was a very diligent doctor, I would not only read the BMJ, I would get the references and I would get out the full text of the articles that might describe what was actually done. Yes, I did that, being the unusually diligent doctor, the less than 1%. So here's the description from a much earlier paper of what they did as the intervention, which was a paywalled one. So fortunately I was in a university that subscribed to this, but otherwise I would have had to pay, $50 or something to get hold of it. It says, this is the description directly quoted from the paper, an individual session followed by 10 weekly group 90-minute sessions with a nutritionist, followed by a transitional stage of some additional sessions. 2, topics in the weekly sessions included getting started, sodium basics, the morning meal, midday sources of sodium, the main meal, planning ahead, creative cooking, eating out, food cues and social support. 3, the sessions included sampling of foods, discussion of articles on sodium reduction and problem solving. 4, the patients kept diaries at least 6 days a week and urine sodiums were measured. I bet you none of you imagined that that's what that first thing was describing, did you? And even this, could you replicate? I mean, first of all, you probably wouldn't bother trying to do this with a patient. Okay, let's get realistic. This is not feasible. But even if you were so diligent that you wanted to do this, could you? No, because you're missing all of the materials here. What happened in each of those weekly sessions? There was clearly material that went along with that. What did the diaries look like? What did they do with the urine sodiums? They tell the patients your urine sodium is X or whatever. Okay, so you can't replicate this intervention even when you've got the paywall details of it. How common a problem is this? Well, we did a study looking at things that we'd selected for the Evidence-Based Medicine Journal, 80 successful treatments that we thought should be used in practice, and we just asked ourselves this question of whether they could be used on Monday morning if you wanted to do this as a general practitioner. The overall rate here was about 50% of things could be replicated. We thought there was enough detail in the paper, so 300 milligrams of aspirin once a day, okay, we can do that. But a lot of things could not be. And it was worse for non-drug therapies than it was for drug therapies, and it was worse for meta-analyses than it was for trials. When we wrote to the authors and did various things to try and improve this improved from a rate of about 50% to 75%, and for non-drug interventions it went from 30% up to about 45%. We've since replicated this for non-drug interventions and found much the same rate, but using a structured checklist and a much more thorough writing to the authors with a series of questions, and we've done better in improving the number, but the base rate was about the same, around about 30%. Now, some of you might imagine, well, okay, but you can always get that information from the authors. It is sitting there. Well, one of the studies that was reported at the Peer Review Congress in Chicago last year was this very interesting one of the rate of permanent loss of data. What they did was for 516 papers that had morphological data on plants, animals and organisms, looking at discriminant analysis of them, they wrote to the authors over a 2-decade period to try and get hold of the data. And you can see if it was recent, they had a pretty good chance of getting it. But by the time they got out to the 20 years here, there was a pretty slim chance of being able to get hold of the data. Authors might be dead, moved, they couldn't track them down. That was one problem, but even if they could track them down, the authors said, well, do you remember floppy disks? We can give you the floppy disks. But etc. So, and their fitted regression curve here says that there's about a 7% permanent loss of data per year. So if we haven't made an archive record of it that can be kept somewhere, we're losing about 7% of our research per year if there isn't a public record that can make it usable. That's an enormous loss and a remediable one. Okay, so I've been talking mostly about the published report, in a sense, this middle bit here. But one of the things that we pointed out, which was the triangle diagram that you might remember in An-Wen Chan's paper, where you sort of got a funnel down to smaller things as you got to the primary report. We've done a slightly different version of that same diagram, and we decided to keep both in the series because they serve different roles. And this is to get us to think that, in fact, the results of the study are more than that published report. There's all sorts of other things that go into it, such as the study registration, the protocol, the study materials, which are often missing when we try and get hold of them in the paper, interim reports, primary data, etc. Then there's the publication, and then there's these subsequent things that follow it up. And the linkage, the other thing we point out with these dotted lines is the linkage between these things is often very poor. It's often hard to trace back to find where the protocol is, even if it is published. And one of the interesting things that we found writing to authors about the descriptions of their interventions is sometimes they'd be quite complaining. They'd say, well, look, we've published that. We published it 2 years after the trial was published. So you should have found it. But they didn't actually have any direct linkage to that. They didn't say they were going to publish it. They didn't report the clinical trials number as well, so that we could easily link up the two. And without those linkages as well, it's actually hard for anybody to reassemble this information. So not only do we need to have this available, it needs to be easily linked if users of research, such as myself, are actually going to find all the bits and pieces. But coming back to the poor reporting part, one of the figures in the paper that you can have a look at focuses just on this section here of the paper report, if you like. This part here, going back to the questions that we asked: why did you start, what did you do, what answer did you get, and what does it mean anyway? And the table here, table 3 in the paper, just goes through some of the figures that we could find in each of those sections: methods, results, discussion, etc. And An-Wen has been through some of those. And these are the sort of range of figures here from about 24% up to 89% of the data missing in each of these sections. Consistent with our original 2009 estimate of about 50% waste at least as a minimum occurring because of poor reporting of the research. So what are we going to do about all of this? I think there are some successful things that have been happening. When we, as was mentioned this morning, had the one-day meeting with the Lancet about 12 months ago, Richard Horton's comment was, well, why don't we just serialise Bad Pharma? And that wouldn't have been a bad idea. Bad Pharma, I think, is a wonderful book, and you should all read it. A subsequent thing was to have the all trials thing, which says all trials should be registered and all results reported, and there's been some great successes in that campaign, in particular because of the Tamiflu disaster. There's been this House of Commons Committee Public Accounts report into that that's also made some very general recommendations well beyond the Tamiflu problem, and they've said that appropriate registration of trials and that the full methods as well as the results of the trials should be available as well, which I think is an important addition to the results being available. But the results, the numbers, are uninterpretable without those methods as well. You can't really interpret what the question is, what the intervention and the comparison was, without that information as well. But we would like to extend this really. Not only should all trials be registered and all results reported, we think all studies should be registered and all results, methods and materials, which was the most commonly missing thing we found in the non-drug interventions. The materials that were given to patients, for example, need to be reported and made publicly available as well. So all trials, I think, is an absolutely fantastic initiative, but what we're talking about in this series includes all trials but goes beyond that for these two reasons. So moving on to our final recommendations, Susan Nickey, who's the psychologist involved in it, whose main area is behavioural interventions and how you get both people and organisations to change, mentioned to us this sort of way of breaking things down into motive, means and opportunity, which the criminologists use for forensics. And so we've sort of broken ours down into the same thing. If you want the more sophisticated version of it, Susan's also got a wonderful implementation wheel, she calls it, which has these translated into capability, opportunity and motivation, but also the sorts of things that you can do about that with education, coercion, training, enablement, regulations, etc. The sort of ways that you can achieve each of those things. There's also a fabulous breakdown of the sorts of interventions you could do, which is partly broken down in Malcolm McLeod's table in the introductory paper. So I'm just going to go through those three, the capability, opportunity and motivation, starting with the motivation or incentives, which several people have mentioned. So our first recommendation really is that funders and research institutions must shift the research regulations and rewards to align with better and more complete reporting. Some of the other recommendations have mentioned that the incentives need to be changed, but we see the fundamental people who are involved in this are the funders and research institutions. The researchers are not going to change this if the incentive systems that they live under don't change. So one example of the sort of research system that people live under is the UK's research evaluation framework. And I think it is good to see that when that came in, it did shift from basically grant income-based incentives to something that was a bit broader than that, that included the research outputs, the impact of the research and the research environment. That was good to see, but the thing that's missing from when we think about the sorts of things that have been discussed throughout the day is with these research outputs, it's just these four best research outputs over a 5-year period. In a way, that's great for quality, but it doesn't mention things like data sharing or the quality of the reporting or giving people access to the materials and all the sorts of things that we've been talking about in terms of waste today. So I think this is a step forward from a purely grant income-based basis, but I think funders need to think more carefully about that because that influences the way the universities and research institutions are going to assess the people that they're hiring and promoting, etc. Infrastructure, and again I think this is fundamentally the funders that can be involved in this. They should take responsibility for reporting infrastructure that gives the support for good reporting and the archiving. I don't think you can leave this as the responsibility of the individual researcher to do this, or even the institutions or journals, who I'll come back to in a moment about what their roles are. I think the fundamental folk involved in this are really the researchers who put out this money, who want the return on that investment that they're making, and that includes archiving that material appropriately. So one example, we give a series, there's a panel of examples in the paper. One example that we give of this is clinicaltrials.gov. There are lots of trials registries, but as you've heard earlier today, clinicaltrials.gov is doing more than simply registering the studies. there's also now an opportunity to put in all of the results that you had pre-specified. So data is now being filled in for those extra unreported outcomes, including the harms outcomes, and we're starting to use it as systematic reviewers to try and find the harms outcomes that aren't reported in the papers. It's a much better way of doing it. If they were better funded, they'd also consider things in the future about whether the full protocols should be submitted there as well and have a repository for them. But at the moment, Deborah Zarin doesn't feel like they've got sufficient funding to be able to do this, which is a real pity because you're losing this valuable resource. And I think the funders are the one group who are able to provide the funding and also the clout, the incentives to be able to do this. The final one is the capacity. We've heard a lot about the inability of people to design studies well. And who's responsible for that? Well, I think this is a broader thing where we see funders, institutions and publishers needing to take a hand in this, and that they should improve the capability and capacity of authors and reviewers in high quality and complete reporting. And if it was in paper 2, I'd also have added, and the design of those studies as well. And I like the suggestion that this feedback should come at the design stage rather than later on. And obviously one of the examples we give is the whole thing triggered off by Consort, but now the Equator network of reporting guidelines that includes not only trials and systematic reviews, but observational studies, animal studies, etc. That sort of work's being done. And the guidelines in this and the training that's involved for researchers is absolutely fundamental for us to make good value out of the money that we invest in research. And if we think of the billions that we invest in research, a small investment in trying to improve the quality of that reporting, even a few percent, will be a huge return on investment. So I'm going to close. Oh, sorry, I realised I left out one missing piece, and that's the research on research as well. This is a page from the NIHR's website on this, that one of the difficulties we had in putting together this paper, as in all of the papers, was the paucity of research on research. And one example of that is I asked lots of people, and maybe somebody in the audience can tell me this, what proportion of published studies is the protocol available publicly? You can find it somewhere without having to write to the author. If someone can catch me over afternoon tea to tell me where that data is available, I would love to know. But they're hard to get hold of, but I couldn't even find documentation of what proportion of protocols were available or not. So I'm going to leave up for the discussion, for the questions, the 3 recommendations that we've made if you want to come back to any of those. And note that we've got different people responsible for those. Thank you.